go.
All right. Welcome to Global Education Futures talk series. And my name is Pavel Luksha. And the purpose of this talk series is to talk about the future of education. What emerges? What changes? We are living in a very interesting moment in our society, where a lot of things come disrupted, not only by technologies, but also by the disrupted relationships within our societies, the growing inequalities, the new forms of colonialism, the new forms of digital colonialism that come to our reality, and disrupted relationship with our planet, which unfortunately we continue to destroy day by day. So we need to find new ways of living into the future ahead of us for our societies to survive and thrive. And some of these ways are not found, many of these ways are not found in the current DNA of the present civilization, of the Western European civilization. We need to look beyond into other traditions, other cultures that some of them are like cradles of our civilization. They hold some of the essential message that is relevant to our collective futures. And today we will speak with a person who carries that message, the elder from Cameroon, Joshua Konkankoh, who basically through the life story has been discovering, caring, exploring, and revealing this message to the world. But before turning to Joshua, I would like first to pass to Alexander, who is my co-host today. Please, Alexander.
Thank you so much, Pavel, and I'm delighted to be here with you and with Konkankoh. We had a lovely conversation yesterday in preparation for this, and what a delight it is to be able to explore together our human potential and to really essentially consider what it means to be human and how do we human well? What role does education play in this process? How can we remember, Pavel, as you were saying, I think that's very well said and very important. How can we remember and restore our human interbeing in the world? And a big part of this now is also the memories of things yet to come, but also the ancient future wisdoms. So remembering what it is that we held high in terms of what it means to human well, and how do we do this as a brotherhood, a sisterhood, as one humanity, as one member of a living species, of many living species, I should say. So these are the stories of our times, and we are bringing to you in this series the wisdom holders and the wisdom co-creators. And Joshua, you are such a wisdom creator and holder that it is a delight for us to be with you. The stories that you have personally, the stories that you bring from your continent and from our planet, I think are ones that can be a source of individual inspiration for our collective aspiration. I pass it over to you and welcome to the GEF Talk series.
Thank you for welcoming me. And what to say about global education futures. When I was growing up in the forest zone of West Africa, the world was for us was the little village in which I was born, and we lived off the land. And the education was just about the food we ate with the families and what we were told about the voice of the unborn child. This is something that triggered me until I came to college to learn that there was a world wider than the village. And that was when the missionaries had come to the village with the Bible to preach, and most importantly, with a gun. And most of our cultures, what we refer to as education had to go on the ground. I thought I should relate to this childhood memory because this is what shows that resilience is also a very important element of education to find out what makes life to be continuous and to be sustainable. So in that light, I learned something like no past, no present, no future. And the responsibility of man to understand and hand down the wisdom of the elders. So this is where I got my first education lesson was when we were invited to be initiated through a rite of passage to become adults and thus to be the custodians of the culture and holders of knowledge. So maybe I could just give a little picture of how this happened and which was transformational. Because for once, we were taught to be silent as we moved through the deep forest to come to a place of the ancestors. And the place of the ancestors is believed to be a space in the virgin forest where no man has treaded. And this is where the shrines of the ancestors and where knowledge from the historic perspective, the idea of a spiritual forest and a virgin forest in the tropical forest dawned on me that the knowledge was not only in the village, and that the community was extended far, far beyond our imagination, almost mystical, because in the silence, we began to download new knowledge. Just listening to strange sounds of animals, listening to the songs of the birds and the rivers. So we came to this clearing and the elders asked us to put our ears to the ground and to listen to Mother Earth and to understand what Mother Earth was telling us. This was an eternity of getting into ourselves and trying to feel and align our connection with Mother Earth and with the ancestors and with knowledge, and to begin to observe that the acquisition of knowledge is not only that which is handed down by the elders, but that which Mother Earth tells us through the silence or through the sounds of other beings and the messages, if only we will stop to listen. So it was always only a period of 7 days, but it was transformational. At the age of 13, I came out of there circumcised, and I was a man. I could climb the trees. I knew what to harvest from the forest, what not to touch, what was spiritual. And this kind of education is indescribable. So some people have come to say that the Ubuntu African universal values of learning are maybe something of the past, and maybe something that we could learn from. So I came through adapting the culture of my village. My village is called Bafut. It's a kingdom in West Africa with in the country now called, rightly or wrongly, Cameroon. It has some structures because they carry the epitome of the colonization. The palace of Bafut is a tourist destination because the Germans fought a battle and couldn't defeat the Bafut people and built a friendship with Bafut, and through that constructed this palace. So colonization also had its advantages. But maybe what is important to say about the Bafut culture is that the Western actions of slavery and colonization actually made this knowledge that went underground to link the spirit in such a way that we who carry and practice the spirit of Ndanifo, you can translate Ndanifo as Ubuntu as practice in Bafut. This carried us from zone 5 because the initiation was about using our faculties and our senses, our 5 senses as we know, but to go beyond. When you go beyond the 5 senses, you go into the spiritual realm where you can start to also align with other sources of knowledge. I think in English language, some people refer to the 6th sense, and that in that realm, you come to a stage of direct perception. And this for us is what is called wisdom, which is not learned in any book and has not passed through Western science. So little did I know that this knowledge was relevant in the world until I joined the Global Eco-Village Network. And this was the beginning of how to connect the indigenous and the modern. Because the concept of eco-village in the West is much more about creating a community and using a scientific design maybe. Whereas the indigenous knowledge that I carry, the gifts of this knowledge into the world, refer more to the things that are usually sidelined by science. Things like the values and the beliefs of the people. Even when I remember these things, sometimes tears come down my eyes through all what I've gone through. trying to see what should not be said in the world, maybe, or coming from where I come from and what I've gone through because of these beliefs. So the way of life, the total way of life of the people enshrined in their culture did not feature in the Millennium Goals and has not featured in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so for the future, we are still dealing with the structures that are designed somewhere and are supposed to be universal. So my interest in global education futures is then if there's really this discourse in the marketplace of ideas about what a universal system could be in systems that do not or that undermine other systems. How are we going to talk through this? This is maybe my interest and my curiosity, and it's more really about questions than answers.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for introducing your story and the story of accessing the ancestral wisdom through your initiation path. I know that part of your story deals with helping young people discover their pathway, empowering them, cultivating their potential in the world. And I know that you have been doing this work in Cameroon and you are doing this work in Portugal, where you currently live. So can you share a little bit about that? What is your approach to working with youth?
By my name and by my initiation, I was charged with helping young people to relearn how to build relationships in the right way to a culture of abundance. Because in the village it was believed that if the young people are not invited to the decision making, I remember I was invited, I was still 13, but I joined the Council of Elders and decision making in the village, that there would be a whooping hole in their hearts, lacking the warmth that we find in our bond of economy, which is, when I refer to abundance, it is the economy of love. We didn't know about money and profits. So when I say the right way is to reconnect them with the land, the culture, and the other members of the community, which could be the plants, the animals, and that if this is done in the right way, there would be abundance for all and free access to knowledge and what we call education now. So our regenerative education model pays attention to the health of our children. Because if we are talking about the future, we are actually talking about children, not forgetting the unborn child. And the quality of their education is about their joy, the way they play, in the way they grow, and especially integrating them in the way we grow food, and what we teach the children in schools. I think this is important even here in the West. In the digital age, AI, artificial intelligence, has taken over the human touch. So this is basically how we connect the schools and the villages through the youth circles that we hold. And with the new knowledge, we also connect the women to their own heritage through the women's circles, and the men in their responsibilities through the men's circles. This is mostly the pillars on which my own work is based. And I have been trying to improve this using also Western tools by improving the circles through youth camps. And for the women, we have something called eco-village design education. And also some principles of Gaia education and dragon dreaming. This we have integrated into our own form of hands-on and action learning called bio-regional education, because education is always tied to the spirit of the place and to the culture of the people. And so through all my interactions with the Global Eco-Village Network, with Gaia Education, I found that this had been branded to serve the world as they know it from the Western perspective. And of course, there is no, the indigenous people, mostly of the global south, are left on the sidelines. So they might as well adapt education to their own needs.
Indeed. I found out now that I'm living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and even though this is the Southern Hemisphere, the global South, it sounds, the global South, Southern Hemisphere, it's only 10 to 12% of the world population. And to understand and bring forward and include what all the voices. I think this is one of the things that we are hearing here. Unity is diversity. And I have already filled one page, Konkankoh, of notes, one full page of just notes and mainly questions. So we need way more than just the hour and a half that we have here. But it is wonderful and rich. There's some things I would like to touch on with you in specific. We'll get to the question of science a bit later, because I think you touched on that a bit and the role of science in education in the future. I really was am very interested in the rites of passage in education and in transformational education, and how we can bring this into our educational practices, our learning practices. Thinking about future ancestor training, because we are ancestors in training right now, and the spiritual forest. So let me not be too much all over the place. Specific questions I have for you to begin with from my side is, you mentioned your name, and I'm wondering what your name means and whether you took on a different name or you were given another name in one of the rites of passage. And that's one part. And the other part is, I was very struck by your mentioning the culture of abundance and the economy of love. These things, how can these be woven into the fabric of our learning? And I don't want to keep this in formal education, all forms of learning how to human well. I've spoken too much. Let me turn it back to you.
Well, any education system that tends to talk about sustainability. In the new situation of the crisis, it's a learning around ecosystems. So affected by conflicts, climate change, colonialism, economic exploitation, and the migration laws of the West. So if education includes decolonization, there will be the challenge of applying what is called human rights in the world. Whether global education futures consider human rights as part of learning for collective consciousness in this age. Then we could begin to talk about indigenous wisdom as part of this ecosystem. Otherwise, there is no need, because science does not consider this measurable in Western sense, using any Western tools. So this brings us to the question of language, because we are talking, when I try to translate my understanding what I call knowledge into English, it doesn't really work. Like, how can I describe to a village person about what you refer to as NTCs, new technologies of communication, because before I left my village, the new phenomenon was the women who still carry radios to the farm. Yeah, but with the war, it's a far-fetched thing. And to talk about ecosystems integrating, it's also to talk about communication. When I mention language, it's like, supposing we were to tweak the known paradigm of North-South partnership or aid or whatever. Supposing someone were to reason from indigenous system upward and were to talk about South-North partnership, would this still mean the same thing? Yeah, so in the age of weaving and networking, we tend to use the tools that we know in the West, in our single track mindedness. This does not include the way indigenous people look at restoration. So we are in a new situation of the Tower of Babel, where we don't understand what we say when we mean by when we use words and these buzzwords and the labels that have been given to things. So before I come to my name, which I know that's what is interesting, but for you, but I would like to just talk about this new situation. If we use words like inclusive, it means we have a prepared agenda where our concept is something that other people can come and participate in. is it really about equity? So it defeats the way that my village people, for example, would take decisions under the baobab tree, because the wisdom is a huge baobab tree on which everybody in the village, under whose shade everybody in the village can sit. And just by its mere immensity, people are bound to respect it because they sit under its shade in the hot sun. They are sheltered, and they are aware that the relationship they have, even with the oxygens in their lungs, it's in direct relation to this tree. And so the way of understanding and using knowledge, it's different. How then can we as one people embrace knowledge? So it happened in my case that for some reason, some people are selected among the initiated. And my name was because during colonization, the women of the village who were the midwives and often also the carriers of knowledge were systematically killed because the Christians called them witches. My grandmother was one of them. And my grandmother, before dying, had already said that these people did not come to heal, but to destroy, because they came with diseases that they didn't know that existed, that never existed on the land, and that the lands needed to be cleansed. And so it would happen that all the parents would have so many children dying of smallpox or measles because they brought a vaccination which they believe the healers could predict the village that these things were injecting some things into the bodies which caused the children to be dying. And because I survived, my grandmother had prayed that I should be given to the gods for protection so that I would survive. And that is the meaning of my name, that I did survive and was given this lofty mission of upholding the ancient wisdom. It's only of recent that as advisor to the king accepted that this knowledge should become a universal thing, because we are now also a tourist destination and people come there to learn. And we believe that knowledge was brought into our system also from external people come visit us. We embraced the emissaries of the Queen, we embraced the Germans, and out of friendship was not only born evil, was also born a lot of good things. So it's the way of the world. But my mission was to help select as an ambassador of the village going out into the world to try to bring only what is good to the people and to leave aside that which is not good for the people.
Konkankoh, I know that part of your story also carries very sad, let's say, experiences, very unfortunate experiences. because you have been building up one of the largest eco-villages in Africa, and then you have experienced the intervention of soldiers through a massive war that destroyed your life's work. And I know that this has been a very traumatizing experience, and that you are living a life of a refugee right now. And you are also discovering the way to continue, which is really admirable, and I believe very inspirational for people around you, including young people that follow your path. So I know that part of your journey involves this trauma healing work, and you are also looking for a way to bring peace to African continent. So can you share a little bit, maybe a little bit about this experience to the extent that you can share, and also how do you see the possibility of healing these traumas that exist there? Is it possible, and what needs to be done?
I think there are people who believe that we cannot have peace if it doesn't come through the barrel of the gun. And that's we have all the powers. I don't know how many hundreds of bases, military bases, a country like the US have around the world, including in my village, somehow in my country. So I mentioned that it's a difficult thing to talk about human rights because my community is in a country that was known as Ambazonia, but which was forcefully put under France. And up to today, the concept of Africa is, I don't know how you describe Africa, because it's a continent which is described by other people, designed by other people, divided by other people, labeled by other people for the interests of other people, except for the Africans. So without being able to define what is Africa, it became very difficult for me in my work, because curiously, this work attracted more Europeans to come and contribute in building this community than the native people, even though the native people also provided the wisdom. And so this is the complex issue that caused the government to term me a terrorist and clamp down on this infrastructure, which I had hoped would enhance education, because the government was insisting on the structures of colonial education. And so it's a very difficult situation where when systems are meant to divide, subjugate, overpower, and so the concept of sharing and learning from each other has been defeated. It's very difficult for me to describe all what I went through and what it means to be a terrorist because of my activities of education and believing that where there is peace, there is progress, and believing that peace can be brokered through negotiation and dialogue, and not necessarily by the argument of force. But who am I? This has been disproven many times over. So maybe this is what I can say, that I discovered my new audience here are the young people I brought with me. I managed to pull out 8 of the think tank of the village, the young ones who are here in Europe and trying to connect with their counterparts here in the North. And then I find here that, of course, the so-called refugees and immigrants don't have a place in Western society. And this is where my heart lies now. Most of my work is now dedicated to these people, because just like myself, they carry a lot of wisdom and knowledge that they bring from their various countries. But unfortunately, they don't have a place. And if you take my case, that I'm even an elder and I'm not able to put food on my table, I'm not able to live as a human being, I don't have my own self-dignity, we are completely despised. And to remember that during the early days of independence, when I was already working in government in the city, it was an embarrassment to hear from a French president when he was asked the question about the genocide during the forceful amalgamation of these countries. That caused so much, that genocide has never been reported. Francois Mitterrand said, never mind, you are a Western journalist, you should know that there are places in this world that genocide happens and it wouldn't matter. And a few years later, I saw the genocide in Rwanda, and it didn't matter until today. Maybe some people say maybe it was wrong, but it's just dismissed with the back of the hand. And curiously, the genocide in Amazonia is not reported. And of course, it doesn't exist. And so these are not grounds on which I want to tread, because it doesn't help us if we are thinking about futures, common futures, collective consciousness. What I'm more concerned about is building this peace village, which I feel is my focus here, as a base for friendships, for people who think in a different way. So there may be a need, I don't know if it's the same in global education futures, that of bringing to a wider audience, maybe that the conceptual and technical planning of what we call education, or be it global for the future, needs alignment with others to fit into the interrelated crisis that is facing all of us in the world today. Because it doesn't matter whether you are in the global so-called north or wherever, this crisis, be it the climate or I mean, there is even the fact that I find even here in the north, that the children have climate anxiety. It's every day that they can't find themselves. And this is not a good base for the world. If all the young people, be them from the developed or the underdeveloped or the civilized, that they don't find themselves in this future that we are talking about. Yeah, so it boils down to the same thing that I carry and which I feel was transformational for me, and that is transformational today, which is about cultivating authentic relationships, connections, and building capacities for emergent learnings, because the learnings that we have so far are not working. If they were working, then our children would be happier.
Indeed. That's the simple, not so simple, but the drastic truth. If they were working, our children would be happier. It's a good metric to think with. To find ourselves as the children, we're all children of the climate crisis. We're all children of the planet under stress. To find ourselves, we must find each other. I know this is at the heart of Ubuntu and Danifo, if I understand correctly as well. And in the spirit of finding each other, I would like to turn to the two of you. I have recently, the two of you meaning Pavel and Konkankoh, and everyone else who is also with us in this conversation and listening, but to you and specifically, because there is something particular that is being shared between the two of you in terms of displacement. And this is becoming a common feature in our world today. And I'm wondering, Pavel, also, if you can share a little bit about that in dialogue with us, so that this becomes not only us in asking questions to Konkankoh, but truly having a conversation among the three of us. Just to preface this, I recently saw a beautiful documentary on television called Mission Joy, Finding Happiness in Troubled Times. And it's a conversation between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And of course, the healing, Archbishop Desmond Tutu is so well known for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what that means, those words, truth and reconciliation, and how to embody in our hearts that capacity to listen. What you were talking about, Konkankoh, about from the spiritual forest, which my senses can be found even in the cities. And to stop and listen beyond our five senses, to be informed. And also then through Danifo to inform each other, not by telling each other, but by creating the conditions where we can be together with life, with all life. So turning this back to you now, Pavel, maybe I can ask you to share a little bit about what it means, displacement, what it means for human beings. This idea of language, sorry, one more thing, this idea of language that the North and the South, as you say, Konkankoh, you know, there are these corrected maps of the world where you see everything upside down. It's not upside down. What is up and down in space is random, right? So what we chose to put on top is random. It's our choice, right? So you can have it the other way around and it makes just as much sense. But we haven't thought that sense. We haven't seen each other in these ways. So displacement, Pavel, tell me a little bit about being invisibilized and what the role of education is to help in these troubled times, to help people find themselves and find each other.
Thank you, Alexander, for asking this question. And I'm also thinking about carrying the stigma that Konkankoh also was talking about. When by the work you're doing, you can be labeled a terrorist, you can be labeled a secret service agent or whatever, like whatever people want to blame you in, and other people believe it. And I think many leaders of the world, especially people that try to work in the grassroots way, frequently find themselves blamed for the work, for the deeds they never have done. So I really resonate with the story of how can we actually establish a human dignity in this very traumatizing and very uncomfortable situation. And I can say about myself that maybe I'm more on the side of a privileged refugee much more than others. I do recognize it, but a lot of people were displaced by the war in Ukraine and have found themselves actually without any home. A lot of people have been displaced because they disagreed with war, being inside Russia, and they left Russia and they cannot find home anywhere because they also blamed as responsible for the war. So they find themselves like between the hammer and the navel in a way. I feel this is also an invitation. By being cast out of the structures of the past that maybe were not shaped by, let's say, in the way that they were supposed to be shaped. This is also an invitation to discover new way of being. What is the new home? Because for at least for how I see this this for me, I don't want to impose this story on Konkankoh, but I dream this can be something resonant. In the past, tribes that had to face, let's say, different situations of exile were also the ones that could find the new promised lands in a way, could establish new ways of being that were healthier in a way than the ones that were left behind, so to say. So I see both the trauma and the potential. It's like being cast into the world to really discover new things. And when I listen to your story, Konkankoh, I feel that this possibility of African peace village that you are now creating with your younger colleagues is extremely inspiring. It's like the message to the world that you carry with yourself, with your the group of young leaders that are working with you. If this dream becomes a reality, this will be like a new beacon, perhaps both for African society, but also for people of the world in Europe, in North America, in Latin America. We need more spaces where people can discover new ways of being, and that's what really inspires me, and that's what I think the situation invites us. Sometimes very uncomfortable that we leave our ways to bring what we have with us into new spaces, and I feel like this maybe is it's traumatic, but it's also a very there is also some kind of hope in that process that I think we are living through.
I resonate very much with what Pavel has said concerning shift in mindsets. Yeah, that's why we've known each other in other spaces where we were really talking about the development of inner capacities. So I don't know any other nature-based solution that is the power of community. Community here with a big C. So my hope is that in this program, and I don't doubt that it takes just a few people to shift things in the world. If Global Education Futures is that laboratory, then we could focus on co-creation. I don't care if it's called South-North or North-South or whatever that brings people together. But I've experimented some kind of partnerships based on permaculture gardens that provides safe spaces for these unfortunate people, the refugees, migrants, that create livelihood. Because it's unimaginable to think that people who are displaced do not have to eat. They are not living, they don't even have to breathe. So instead of creating more and more prison camps, and I refer again to what you said, Alexander, about Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. As religious leaders, they are also opinion leaders, and their opinions really counted after apartheid. And if whatever conflicts exist that human beings cannot meet, I think it's through building these social relationships that there could be an awareness about reconciliation, because we can't even talk about any other thing when we don't agree on anything. I don't think the children in Africa don't even know about this history that I lived. They don't even know why their countries are called what they are called, and why children don't have to go to school. They have to be laboring in either in the mines or growing coffee and cocoa that they don't eat. So it is problematic that I often find when we are talking about collective consciousness. It's easier to talk about things than to actually practice them.
And the practice comes in community is what I'm hearing as well. It comes in engagement, not just talking about it. It comes in living. So how do we do that? I would ask you, Konkankoh, if you could share with us a little more about the permaculture gardens, because my sense is that this is also part of the pattern of education for the future, what you have tapped into here. And I'm sure it draws on Danifo very strongly in ways that make this not just permaculture. Permaculture is not just, it's huge, but I'm sure you have enriched the notion of permaculture in ways that go into human culture very deeply. And perhaps you can talk about the permaculture of growing good humans, healthy humans. How was that for you?
I would reduce it to one word. We can call it regenerative business of life, in the sense of how we nurture and sustain life. Because it's all these buzzwords when Westerners go around and collect knowledge from the grassroots, they patent it, they brand it, and it becomes this mysterious scientific thing that the indigenous people do no longer recognize themselves in. So I think that if there is the intention for an emergence, then we are looking for practices which are common. And Danifo left from a practice of just ancestral wisdom to integrating the modern way of designing projects. And this is the holistic way where human relationships count, where moral values count. Unfortunately, permaculture has been made into this mysterious thing that people think it's a hippie way of life and not something that can be used to build healthy relationships or healthy food or healthy climate. It's the untapped resource in these global education futures that we are talking about. And it's the thing that I have seen, that young people who are smarter, turning towards these small pockets of, unfortunately, there are not really many places where people can really do hands-on permaculture, apart from educating Western elites and giving them certificates to go and teach the Africans. And the small anecdote here is that when there were Ukrainian refugees, suddenly this platform on which I belong, called Permaculture for Refugees, suddenly invited me to Spain, where refugees from all over the world gathered to see how we could talk a common language. But the language was that, okay, refugees are Ukrainians, they can be helped. But those others can come and serve the Ukrainians because they are not important. So and then this was in a permaculture convergence, but this is not permaculture language. Yeah, it's really, it boils down to the same thing. Whether refugees in other places are important. There has never been a program, because we arrived we are black skinned, we don't matter. But we can matter if we can be used to help the refugees from Ukraine, you know. So it's this really mindset that Pavel made a reference to, that I think is the capital thing of whether we want to build or to continue to build our hypocritical systems and praise ourselves for being very, very scientific in our thinking.
Konkankoh, you are mentioning the regenerative economy perspective, and you also mentioned the idea of economy of love that prevailed in your community, which was a traditional way of organizing things. And I think you were also mentioning, referring to that less directly, about the food systems. And I know that you have been studying food systems, you have been organizing food systems, you have been teaching about food. And you mentioned that some of the food that is now produced in African continent is never consumed in African continent. And when I listen to you, I actually recognize, well, we sort of carry that knowledge, but we never explicitly share it, that Western education prioritizes all forms of literacy, how to write, how to read, how to calculate, but there is no food literacy in the basic education, on one hand. On the other hand, the current system of production of food is the global system, which kind of separates the food production from the food consumption. And enormous amounts of food are lost just in logistics, like about 1/3 of the whole food production. And it's more than is needed to feed the population that is currently starving. And another thing that you have been talking about, this regenerative, is I think part of the story is the idea of relocalizing. How do we bring back the production and the consumption to the areas where, let's say, this is needed most? How do we reconnect people with their own sources of food so they know where this food comes from? Because this is essential. Like, we eat every day. This is what builds up our bodies. This is also what builds up our minds, if we think about how these chemicals work in our bodies. So what is your perspective? How do we re-educate people, and how do we move towards that regenerative paradigm, and maybe the economy of love at a larger scale? Is that possible? Is that part of the human dream that we can think about?
I started my introduction with no past, no present, no future. When a history, from the way I remember history, the great kings were sending out expeditions into the world. And at first it was about friendship, building trade relations and friendships. It's later that it became conquer and exploit and own. If you want to relate this to the Ubuntu, which it's about, we didn't have money. We didn't, we knew that our economy was food. So the love that you experience is when people eat together. In our culture, it is said that the family that eats together stays together. So food is the component that represents love and is the component that represents money. Because if you were going to get married, it was just exchange of some food items, maybe a cow, a goat, for families to share and unite and be one. Actually, what we call love in my local language means solidarity. And this is, I don't know of any other economy which is better than this, and any education system which is better than this, because it boils down to how we grow food and what we teach our children.
The meaning of regeneration is healing. Truly, it is in its source the same notion, and that has to do with health. Healthy food, healthy relationships, healthy ways of being. So this is the permaculture I'm hearing that is at the heart of Danifo and what you have been sharing. There is I've heard this beautiful shift in consciousness. It's not, you don't hear a shift in, but I heard an expression that says we must shift from the verbs divide and conquer to divine and concur. So to divine is to connect, yes, and to concur is to work. So divine and concur. This is a slight shift makes all the difference. So I have a last, we're wrapping up now. We're coming toward the end of our conversation time with you, which has been way too short, Konkankoh, but I have one last comment and then a question for you to consider together. For me, this has been a conversation very much about how to human well, very much at the heart of what Global Education Futures explores, and how we can bring this conversation into educational fora all over the world now, and as a way of informing our practices of learning, of teaching, of education in general. How do we human well? And what we have been discussing here, I feel, has to do with full spectrum humaning. How do we human well, not just for some of us, but for all of us? How do we human well in full spectrum engagement with what it means to be human in all ways? This leads me to my question. I had a student who was now Dr. Shay Brown, who introduced me to the concept of post-disciplinary education. I thought that was fantastic, because transdisciplinary is where I was surviving and thriving and saying we must move beyond the disciplines which break things down and separate things, and we must bring to a transdisciplinary understanding which integrates things. Wonderful, yes. And the post-disciplinary frameworks bring into being other ways of knowing that are not discipline bound. Indigenous ways of knowing that we have been talking about here as well, post-disciplinary in that sense. And so this is my question for you, Konkankoh. You've talked about science. One of the things I am exploring has to do with the evolution of science. And I agree that old paradigm science is almost a form of engineering the human soul. It's difficult and not healthy. But what of the evolution of science as well, maybe into post-disciplinary frames, ways that don't include just Western science, because there are many other forms of science, not just Western science, and that can celebrate not just the 5 dimensions of knowing, 5 senses, but also ways of knowing that bring us into understanding of ourselves, of each other, of nature, and of our universe that extend beyond the 5 senses. This can also be done in an evolution of what we mean by science. Do you hold hope for that, or how do you feel the role of science in our learning patterns?
You're making me, without question, Alexander, to feel that if global education features were to fully integrate the source of indigenous wisdom, we can as well call that science, because we knew that as our science. We didn't know, actually, in the spirit world, thunder could be sent to strike somewhere, people could turn into animals. So if global education futures was to be this place for innovation and social instruction, then we could find a way to bridge these 2 worlds. Because as far as I know, science stems from observation. And also, indigenous wisdom stems from observing with the mind in the mind's world. And these 2 have a connection. And if we are going to resolve the issues of the crisis of education and the crisis in the world, we need to be able to connect the internal and the external in a harmonious way.
Pavel, as I pass it on to you then for some closing remarks and to wrap up, thank you so much, Konkankoh. It reminds me of a friend of mine who is a Lama from Tibet. He said at one point, he said, you know, part of our challenge is that we have to learn to think in a new way. And he touched his heart. And somebody was there who said, you know, interesting, in the West, we say we have to learn to think in a new way, and we touch our head. And he said, that is the problem. So I like that.
Wow, as I'm touching my head now, recognizing that I need to think in a new way, I'm also deeply touched here. I feel that for sure. And to conclude, I feel that for me the conversation today was extremely illuminative. I really would like to thank you, Konkankoh, for sharing your perspective, because I think we take too many things in education for granted. Like you mentioned, the priorities of sustainable development goals, the ideas of every child on the planet has to be literate, but that literacy means ability to read and write. Whereas you have been highlighting other forms of literacy. You have been talking about different sources of knowledge that need to be integrated. You were talking about the connection to ancestral wisdom that really helps us discover our pathways throughout life. That I think very few people in the modern educational systems could say they are connecting with those ways after 10 or 12 years of education. So I'm extremely curious to explore further what it actually means to connect the indigenous ways with modern ways, and maybe to share a little bit about a couple of stories. Maybe I don't want to take too long, but one story that I think one of the most inspirational experiences for me in looking at different forms of education in the last few years was my journey to New Zealand. When I saw the school where traditional Maori ways of learning were integrated with modern, let's say, Western ways of learning. And the basis of learning within that school, which was targeting the traditional Maori population, was singing, actually, because it's very musical culture. And they sing between 2 and 4 hours every day. This is a communal practice. They sing when they need to learn new things. They actually compose songs about for example, mathematics or colors or geometrical shapes. And it really touched me so deeply. I mean, I saw a totally different ways of approaching things that is much more inspirational, that is much more human oriented. And this is the moment when it kind of clicked for me. Yes, the way of learning that was considered, for some reason, was considered, let's say, less progressive, is really the answer to the future. We are now looking how to educate people holistically, how to educate them in a way that helps them to deal with challenges such as artificial intelligence, complexity of the world, climate crisis, and so on and so on. There is a way, and the way is in the indigenous knowledge that we need to rediscover and reconnect with modern human systems. And actually that took me on my journey with connection with some indigenous traditions, and I went on one hand to Central Asia to discover some approaches that exist there, on the other hand to South America. And yeah, maybe something I should share. I've been thinking about the names that have been given in those traditions. And it's actually the name, one of the names refers to the ways of discovering the future, and another name refers to the amplification. So I feel like my role is actually, I'm listening to you and your role with your name that was given to you. I discovered very recently, just thinking about those names, what it actually means. Recognize that what they're telling me is that we need to amplify the voice of the future. Because you say no future, no past, no present, but I think the possibility of thriving future is here. And I think this is what we can create together if we learn to human better, to human well. And I really want to thank you for being with us today, for sharing your dream, your story, your trauma, your very challenging but also very inspiring life path with us. Thank you very much for this. And I feel like this is a very important message that gives hope for the future, better future, the human future. So thank you very much. And we look forward to actually explore the idea of creating the lab. Let's think about that too. I think this was another very inspiring part of our conversation.
Konkankoh, any last for this session, but there will be more conversations that we will have. We're not letting go of you. But if there's anything that you would like to share with us and with those who are listening, to take with us in our hearts as we move forward.
I think that word will be the thing again that affects all of us in the world, and that we are all in one boat. And for me, resilience is awareness. This is what I can share about my experiences that have not only made me to develop thick skin, but to be more aware. in this human presence.
Thank you. And with that, I think we are ending this talk.
And inviting everyone to come next time when we're going to be hearing from Gail Taylor, who will be sharing with us about her views and visions of education and the future and how to human well, and the notion of scaffolding. How does nature scaffold itself? How do we scaffold each other in creating our truest potential? What, Pavel, you've been talking about is augmenting. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.